Hey guys, real quick, I want to go over the quiz answers. Yes. We might just fact. Which following was not a law imposed by Southern states to deny African Americans the right to vote? Tuskegee exam C, not is the key part for there.
I was right.
Circle it.
What is it?
Circle it. You just circled it right now, not when you're taking it.
Wait, what is it?
C, Tuskegee exams. In 1896, the Supreme Court of Pleasant v. Ferguson upheld the Louisiana law and the doctrine of separate but equal being. Who was the founder of the Tuskegee Institute? Not W.D. Du Bois, not Ida Wells, not George Washington Carver.
Didn't he like do something with peanuts?
I said
We talked about it.
yes.
Who was African American leader who opposed Atlanta Compromise? W.D. Du Bois.
Yes, I got that.
In 1892, blank fire young African women. Ladies, woman, not so obviously it's not going to be Grover Cleveland.
My name is Cleveland Brown.
Ida B. Wells.
I knew it. I read her book. Number 3 was D. I knew it.
Everybody, I want to give today we're going to talk about the Spanish American War. I want to give you just maybe 2 or 3 more minutes to work on the warm-up.
Oh my God,
Focus on the warm-up.
Allison, you just keep going.
Wait a minute.
Like the harass.
Turn around. I want you facing. Come on. Hey. Guys, for that last quiz that we just took, the average is 86% for this one.
Yeah.
So we did really well. This last one we just went over.
What did Krypton say?
Not good.
Argon.
What about Argon?
Yeah.
You beat Argon by a lot.
What is one?
Can't brag at Argon. You don't know.
They switched it to
Hey, guess who beat you on the common though? They did.
So, I wasn't scared. That thing was rigged. It was rigged.
I had about 5 people in this class get you or something like that.
Wait, was 8 on my stuff?
Alright, we are going to get started. So, where's my clicker today?
A mod 6 clicker and a home collection?
Oh no! Yeah!
You're bad. So people do that. You can do that.
Alright, so make sure you have your notebooks out. You're ready to start writing everything down. Today we're going to talk about the beginning of imperialism for the United States. So the big event, remember last week we learned about the United States purchasing Alaska from Russia, gaining another state, and taking over Hawaii. Hawaii eventually being incorporated into another state. That was the first time that the United States had territory outside of the continental U.S. But the event that we're going to learn about today from 1898, the Spanish-American War, this is us becoming an empire. We're going to increase our land. We're going to have control over Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, islands of the Pacific. So this is really important. The Spanish-American War, it was only 4 months. But in those 4 months, I mean, this is one of the most important events in shaping future American policy and the way that we view ourselves around the world. So, but this will be the title. Cool. So, 4th thing to write down. These were the causes of the Spanish-American War. The United States, they were very much in support of Cuban independence. At the time, Cuba, they were colonized by the Spanish. Cuba was one of the oldest Spanish colonies. They had slavery had existed in Spain up until like 1888 or what? Yeah. So the Cuban people, most of them were slaves. It was an agricultural society. The entire economy was tied into sugar. So the U.S., they were extremely sympathetic. There was news stories coming out about Spanish atrocities. The way that they were treating the Cuban people was disgusting. So Americans were sympathetic. The second reason, to protect U.S. business interests in Cuba. We'll look at a map in a minute, but if you see where Cuba is, it's only like 90 miles off the coast of the U.S. So yeah, it's super close to Florida. We have a lot of businesses tied up in Cuba at that time, especially in like sugar plantations. So we're very much tied into the Cuban economy. The third cause of the Spanish-American War, yellow journalism. So in your warm-up, you read about William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. They were these 2 media moguls at that time. If you can, do you have a question?
Yeah. Is it U.S. Maine or USS Maine?
What USS Maine? But it's a ship. It's a big naval battleship that blew up off the coast of Havana. And this was, but I'll talk about it in just a second. But you just need to know it's a ship. It's called the Maine. So yellow journalism. At the time, there's no television. There's no internet. You can't go on to Facebook and see your headline for what's going on around the world. The people that controlled the news media at that time, they were.
Hey guys, all the extra chat needs to stop.
Yeah, this is very important. They were these guys, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. They wrote these sensationalist stories in order to sell newspapers. They were basically like the tabloids of the day. They would write things like the Spanish imprison Cuban, Spanish execute Cuban, and it made people extremely sympathetic towards the plight of the Cubans. And then the next thing, the sinking of the USS Maine. There was the USS Maine was this big naval ship that we brought off the coast of Cuba. The ship, there was like an electrical fire in the engine room, and there was an explosion and the ship sank. But immediately what these yellow journalists did is they pointed the finger at Spain. They said, this is Spain's fault, and they got the American people very fired up. The rallying cry to go to war with Spain was, like, you remember you learned about the Mexican-American War, remember the Alamo? This was remember the Maine. To hell with Spain, remember the Maine. That's the thing to take away. Yep. Next one? Cool. So you don't need to know everything about Cuban history, but just briefly. So Cuba and Puerto Rico, they were both part of the Spanish Empire. The United States, they put a tariff on the sugar that was being exported from Cuba. This had the effect of making the Cuban economy collapse. So Cuban people, they were frustrated. Their economy had sort of gone defunct, and they were frustrated over the treatment they were receiving by the Spanish colonial power at that time. So this guy, Jose Marti, this revolutionary, he fought to try and create an independent Cuba. And that's sort of where the seeds of the revolution began. Come on, gotta go next one. Cool. So yellow journalism, very, very, very important. Make sure you write this down. Yellow journalism, a type of sensational, biased, and often false reporting for the sake of attracting readers. There's a famous story that I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but people talk about it. Before the Spanish-American War began, William Randolph Hearst, he had a newspaperman living in Havana. And the gentleman here reported back to Hearst saying, look, the situation here is calm. There's not going to be a war between the U.S. and Spain. There's nothing going on here. What Hearst's response was, you provide me with the pictures and I'll provide you with the war. So he was essentially saying, if I can cover this, I can sell millions of newspapers by making people think that the Spanish attacked the United States, and I'll get the American people on the side of war, basically to sell newspapers, and he got away with it. There's a really cool movie. You might think it's boring, it's black and white, but it's like considered one of the #1 or #2 most famous movies of all time. It's called Citizen Kane. If you have any free time, you should go watch that movie. It's pretty good. Citizen Kane, write it down. But it's about the life of William Randolph Hearst, and he was this self-made man, newspaper mogul, that he had so much sway, and I mean, we learned about all these, Robert Barron was a big business guy. This guy, Randolph Hearst, he had control, he really controlled policy of the United States through the media. That's a movie, if you want to check it out. Next one. So remember the Maine. William McKinley at this time, he didn't immediately want to go to war, but the people that did want to go to war inside the United States, it was called jingoism, and these were the extreme nationalists. They wanted the United States to expand their role in the world. They wanted to attack Spain. They wanted to claim territory. These would be, think like the most right-wing, kind of hawkish people that you could compare it to, after 9/11, the people in Congress who said, we have to go invade Iraq. We have to do this right away. That would be comparable to these jingoists. The biggest one's name was Theodore Roosevelt, and he couldn't wait to go to war. He'll become a hero in the Spanish-American War, and this will later give him the platform to later become president. But he becomes a hero in this conflict.
How many people died in the transfer?
You'll do the next one. So this is a cool picture here. The picture on the left-hand side, like war propaganda was huge at that time. If you ever go to the Archives Museum down the street, they have a really cool exhibit with old like war propaganda posters. But this was a big one. So remember, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. This was an explosion inside the ship. This wasn't, an attack from the Spanish. But immediately, the newspaper, this is what William Randolph Hearst reported. $50,000 reward for the detection of the perpetrator. Like, who did it? Destruction of the warship Maine with the work of an enemy. This would be like the cover of the Washington Post. And it was like treated like a tabloid. But people were like, yeah, let's go to war. Let's, what's it?
So these people basically kind of knew that Spain probably didn't cause this, but they just wanted an excuse.
I don't think that they necessarily knew that Spain didn't cause it, but they were willing to report what they needed to report to sell newspapers. So this war, they were going to make a lot of money by selling newspapers. Prior to the explosion of the USS Maine, they were reporting on atrocities inside of Spain, and some of them were true. So over time, they were trying to build up support, just saying, look how bad these imperialists are, and yeah. So
So like when magazines today, like the covers,
The national requirements.
the covers,
Yeah,
some of
it's
them
a
have,
tabloid.
like some of the parts of the stories are true, and some of it's not, but they still report it anyway because they want to sell magazines, right?
Is Bigfoot real?
Yes.
Someone reported him, somebody took pictures, so.
He's not real.
And you can't prove he's not, so
Yeah.
you can't
Yeah,
say what I'm right is wrong.
It doesn't really matter.
Only if you realize he lived in the ocean.
Ahmad, do you want to jump in? So real quick, I want you guys to get an idea. Prior to what we learned about last week, the United States was contained to the continental U.S. So we've already purchased Alaska from Russia. So now we're outside of the continental U.S. Remember we learned about Hawaii. We claimed Hawaii because of the Dole Fruit Company, and we overthrew the Queen, and we enforced the Constitution on them. And so we basically annexed Hawaii, and they later become a state. So now we have our first naval base in the Pacific with Hawaii. So the result of the Spanish-American War. Spain at the time, does everyone know where Spain is?
It's in Europe.
It's over here, it's in Europe. Like 150 years earlier, they were one of the most powerful empires in the world. Like at this point in the late 1890s, most of South America, they're already independent countries. But so Spain, at one time, they control essentially all of South America, the Caribbean, parts of North America. Sorry, I'm making a mess. But now their empire is really, really small. So the United States, they picked a fight with, they were an old world colonial power, but they picked a fight with an opponent that they could beat. They had an old out-of-date military. Like their naval ships, they had still like wooden ships, sort of like Civil War era ships. Yeah.
Yeah, what about Iron Fleet?
Well, that's what the United States has. So we had like steel, we had iron mass. It'd be like modern day. It'd be like a cavalry horse going up against a tank. I mean, we just decimated their navy. They weren't as modern as we were. So the areas that we would claim, we would claim Cuba, Puerto Rico, and then over here the Philippines and Guam. So can anyone remember the conversation we had last week of why it was important for the United States to annex Hawaii, at least militarily? Like what purpose did that serve? Gabriel.
Because it was like a military port for ships. You know, it was a port for ships and also for like traders.
Yeah, and also what kind of protection did it create?
And cause like there was that entire barrier of islands that the U.S. claimed, so they would have complete protection from all enemies trying to attack them from the Pacific Ocean.
That's right on. So the United States, when they decided that they were going to go to war over Cuba in response to the sinking of the Maine, their strategy was the first thing that we have to do. But first thing we have to do to Spain is we have to knock out their navy. And where the Spanish naval fleet was in the Philippines. So President McKinley, he orders a preemptive strike. The general's name is Dowell. You'll see it on the next slide. But,
D-O-W-E.
yeah, actually, you want to jump to the next slide? We'll show it. So I'm sorry, no, his name is Dewey. So George Dewey, he goes to the Philippines and he crushes the Spanish fleet. It's the United States' modern ships versus these outdated Spanish ships. And they crush the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, and they're able to conquer the Philippines. In Cuba, anyone recognize this handsome guy on the horse? Yeah. Teddy Roosevelt. So this is this picture here. This is the time of yellow journalism. This is from like a cartoon. So this is a comic book, a children's comic book. He really painted this picture of himself as a war hero. This is a time when he could shine. He had this volunteer military force. They invaded Cuba, and Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders were able to win Cuban independence. Actually, it's kind of funny. In this picture, they're depicted as these horse-riding cowboys, but they actually didn't have horses in any of the battles. Their horses didn't make it over on the ships. So they're an infantry force. But the famous battle that Teddy Roosevelt gets credit for is called the Battle of San Juan Hill, where they charge up this mountain and they're able to conquer San Juan Hill and they win independence for the. We're in Cuba. So they liberate Cuba. At the time, you know, it's not like he did this alone. There was regular army units at the time. There was also there were several extremely important African American units at the time. They were called the Buffalo Soldiers, and they were extremely important too. But because you know the United States, I don't know. The way they reported it, the one who got the credit was Theodore Roosevelt. Yeah.
Was it San Juan in Puerto Rico?
That's the capital of Puerto Rico, but San Juan Hill is the name of the battle in Cuba.
Oh.
Yeah. You have a question?
Yeah, what did he think about foreign relations?
So Teddy Roosevelt, remember we learned about jingoism. Jingoism. So he prior to the beginning of this war, he's Assistant Secretary of War. That's his position. Back then, they didn't call it the Secretary of Defense. They called it the Secretary of War. It was a lot cooler name. But he was a pro-war guy. He thought that he wanted the United States to be an imperial power. Like England had colonies, France had colonies. It was time for the United States. This goes back to like American exceptionalism. Like it was time for the United States to stand up and be a power in the world. Next slide. So these are all important things that you should take away from this. Not everybody thought that it was a good idea for the United States to annex the Philippines. There was two arguing camps inside of Congress and inside of the United States. So this was the supporters. And the supporters, those would be people like Theodore Roosevelt, anybody who was pro-imperialism, pro-war. They needed to have a justification for why it was a good idea to go to war. So the first reason they gave was a Pacific naval base. If you look at where the Philippines is in the world in Asia, it was important because it could protect the West Coast. It could put them in a good position to defend against places like China or whoever. I mean, it gave them a foothold in Asia. Another important thing was for trade. It created a stopover point on the way to China, because if the United States is here and you have Hawaii in the middle, it just gave you one more port that you could fuel, you could drop off goods, you could do whatever. It gave you a port a little bit closer to Asia, because I mean Hawaii, even though it's in the middle of the Pacific, it's not that close to Japan or China or of Asia. The third reason was, by conquering this giant new country, we could force our goods on them. We could trade with them. We could make a lot of money. Do you have a question?
It was hard to conquer because of the $207.
It was hard to conquer because of what?
$207.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we
How many islands are in the Philippines?
Yeah.
there's a ton. It was easy to conquer Manila, and it was easy. That's the capital of the Philippines. It was easy to conquer Manila. It was easy to crush the Spanish. But you don't need to learn about it in this class, but I would definitely say you should do some research about it because it's super interesting. But the Filipino people, even after the United States, kicks out Spain, they want their independence. They're still a revolutionary. They want to be an independent country. They would eventually get full independence, but it wouldn't be until after World War II.
Wait, Filipinos spelled effort.
So if you're saying like the people, like, so the country is with a P, but like the people, you would say with an F.
Do you know why?
Why?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm so flaky using the
Yeah. So okay. So the fourth reason. Sorry. You want to say something?
Oh, and the reason Spain took the Philippines is because of the resources and where they could plant and good over.
Yeah, absolutely. There was tons of economic benefits.
Alvin, in Philippines, do they speak Spanish, English, and What's
Tagalog is like some is Spanish, like basura means trash. It's the same.
so that's like kind of like a lower income language? Or no?
It's like
Slang.
a national language, and there's like another two, but it's like for like downward, southward.
But they teach they teach,
Yeah, they teach
schools
English.
taught in English.
Yeah,
Okay.
but we speak Tagalog still.
Do you have a favorite Filipino food? Totally unrelated, but I'm hungry.
Sinigang.
What is that?
Sinigang.
What is that?
It's like soup, and you can do pork or fish.
That's good. Okay, so back to this. There was economic incentives for the United States to having large markets, American goods. The other reason at the time we were. The United States was a little bit racist, so they figured that they were going to civilize these less civilized people. Yeah, nativists would be the term. They had a duty to help these people. They had a moral obligation to spread American value. And that was, by taking over this country, they weren't colonists. They were doing they had a higher duty. They were helping these people by giving them American values, American systems. Yeah.
Isn't assimilation wrong?
This was just the reason that they gave as a justification. It's like if you're going to do something, say if I want to go tomorrow, if I want to go attack Canada, I can't just do it. I need to justify it. I need to have a reason. I need to say I need a moral reason. So the opponents of the war, they thought that the cost of having an empire would be way too expensive. They didn't see an economic incentive. They said, like, what are we going to have to do? Pay for all this infrastructure in the Philippines, pay for bureaucrats, pay for jobs. And at the time, like leading up to 10 years before this, the American economy was in a depression. So people, they see the prospect of spending all this money halfway across the world. It's kind of crazy. They don't like it. The second reason, this would go along with labor unions and the workers in the United States. Again, people were really fearful of losing their jobs. So they thought that if we had this territory in the Philippines, what's going to stop companies from opening up factories, paying the Filipinos way less for the same jobs, and then taking jobs away from Americans. So they were incredibly fearful of that prospect. And imperialism, like that's what Europeans did. That's not what Americans did. Yeah, go for it. So this picture here, this is anyone recognize these guys?
Yes. No, I can't see it. Is that
You can't see it.
George Washington.
It kind of looks like George Washington, but it's
I don't know. I just remember.
so these are like two conquerors. You have Napoleon and you have Julius Caesar, and they're these in history. They're the two conquerors that claim vast areas of land. They build giant empires. And here you have little Mr. McKinley, President of the United States. He's standing on top of the Philippines, and they're sort of like looking at him like, all right, here's the United States is on the scene. They're finally going to have an empire of their own. Come on, next one.
Hey guys, we're not going to the bathroom until after the notes. It's always the same rule.
They're wearing grass.
So anybody out of their seat without permission has lost their mind. So no one should be up out of their seat without asking permission, and we're not going to the bathroom until after the notes.
Let's just go
So, almost not.
Michaela, do you know why they call it the V Paris every time? Because that's where the treaties are signed.
Yeah.
Why in Paris?
Paris was like kind of the central location for all of Europe. And so when you're signing something for Europe, the United States wasn't going to go sign it in Madrid, in Spain, right? And Spain wasn't going to be the United States. So like Paris was always kind of a good middle ground to sign treaties. Like when US was signing treaties with England after the war, they're not going to sign it in London. And England's not going to sign it in the United States.
Because that's your own territory.
Yeah, so like, so Paris was always kind of a good middle ground for treaties. And there's going to be, hey, guess what? There's going to be another one too.
Another one?
Yeah.
Another one.
Treaty of Paris.
But then there's going to be the Treaty of Versailles, which is a castle right outside of Paris.
Oh my God.
Switch it up.
Napoleon's house.
Napoleon's house.
So,
Napoleon's awesome.
so real quick, so the results of this Treaty of Paris in
Thank you, man.
1888.
Thanks.
Now look at the size of the empire of the United States now. We're not a continental nation. We have all these islands in the Pacific. We have the Philippines. We have Alaska. We have Hawaii. The United States could finally, they on the world map, when they were comparing themselves to these imperial nations in Europe, they could finally say we're an imperial power. We're a power on the world stage. Next one. Cool. So the Platt Amendment. Alvin, you have a question? It says amendment. It's a little bit cut off. So the Platt Amendment. So we fought for Cuban independence. That's what we were trying to do. We defeat the Spanish. We're going to make an independent Cuba. But what in fact happened is we signed this Platt Amendment. So the Cubans, they really didn't have self-determination. The United States, they controlled everything they did. These are some of the stipulations. Cuba, they weren't allowed to make any treaties. The U.S. has naval bases. Does anyone know the famous base that's still in Cuba today? You hear about it in the news?
Guantanamo Bay.
Yes. Guantanamo Bay. Yeah, Pearl Harbor's Hawaii. So that.
I was joking.
Okay, it's not that far off. So we still have Guantanamo Bay today. Another thing that the United States insisted on. So Cuba, they were not allowed to build up strong debts with other countries. And the reason for this is, even though the United States thought that they were this world power now and they were kind of pumping their chests on the world stage, in fact, we kind of beat up a weak opponent in Spain. So what we didn't want Cuba to owe all this money to England, and then England come in with their navy. Because that would have been devastating. We didn't want to fight another war. So we said to Cuba, you're not allowed to build up debt. You basically can't make any other countries angry at you. You can't take a lot of goods on credit. You can't build up debt, because then we'd have to come in and help you, and frankly, we are not in a good enough position to fight another war. So that was a stipulation. Question?
Wasn't it recent that people in the West Indies were going to Cuba?
Yeah. So you'll learn about that later. That's got more to do with communism and the Cold War and Fidel Castro. So those barriers are finally breaking down. At this time, we had lots of businesses in Cuba, and up until Fidel Castro, you don't need to know about this, but the United States was extremely involved in Cuba. It was sort of the playground of the U.S. Yes?
What was the Cuban Missile Crisis?
You're going to learn about that later. It's not as important, but it has to do with communism. It has to do with the Cold War. Yep. And I promise you, you're going to learn about it. It's super, super interesting. We don't have to learn about it for this. It's pretty cool. So basically, all of these stipulations in the Platt Amendment. Yeah.
Flat.
Do you have a question?
Oh, yeah. So, what's so bad about communism?
Guys, we're not talking about that.
You don't need to learn about communism right now, but I hope you're in a couple of weeks. I hope you're just as excited, because you're gonna learn all about it. All right, next one.
I'm not saying that I'm a favorite.
Has anyone been to Puerto Rico?
Yes, North Korea.
You want to be like North Korea?
You have a question? Oh, you've been to Puerto Rico?
We're joking.
All right, Helios. We're gonna have a conversation. We're having a conversation as a class, so raise your hand. This is the last slide.
Yeah, this is the last slide. Hannah, do you have a question?
Still not
Everyone
talking.
give Hannah their full undivided attention.
Where was it fought? Like it was fought?
So it was fought in several places. Here's the United States. Here's Cuba. I know, I'm a great artist, but so the first thing that the United States is going to do, they're going to destroy the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. They're going to fight a two-front war. So one of them is all the way over by Asia. First, they're going to conquer the Philippines, and then they're going to bring their troops down here. And these are people like Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, and they're gonna crush the Spanish in Cuba. So it's a two-front war. Yeah.
With 2 fronts of what?
Two fronts are the Philippines. The Philippines, and that's in Asia, that's in the Pacific. And the other front is going to be in the Caribbean, Cuba. So it's a two-front war. They're fighting. They got to knock out the Philippines so that they can destroy the Spanish Navy. Yeah.
Why?
Why did they do that?
US fought on 2 fronts.
Because. So why would they do that? Because if the Spanish Navy was still intact, if the U.S. invaded Cuba without knocking out the Spanish Navy, all of the West Coast would be in jeopardy. Maybe the Spanish Navy would take their troops and attack Hawaii, or maybe they would attack San Francisco. The United States, they were preempted. They said, you know what, if we can just knock out their Navy while it's still sitting in the harbor of Manila, and the war will be a lot easier. And it was. I mean, the U.S. had naval dominance. And the whole war only took 4 months, and we were able to take these vast areas of land. Puerto Rico was another colony of, they were under Spanish control. So when we defeat Spain during the Spanish-American War, we also get Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, they're not a state right now, but their history, so in 1900, they had Congress pass something called the Forester Act, and basically it established a government in Puerto Rico. 1917, Puerto Ricans became citizens in the United States, and still to this day there's debate on whether or not Puerto Rico will become the next state. But that hasn't happened yet. A lot of Puerto Ricans, they want to keep their independence. Did I make the homework? I did. So, okay, so